Yesterday we left off with, Dermot had gotten his support from Henry II, who said he could go and recruit from some of his lords that were back in England, mostly around the Wales area. And Dermot was successful. He had gotten the support of Richard de Clare, whom Dermot had offered his daughter in marriage, and then the to inherit the kingdom of Leinster after the death of Dermot. And he'd gotten a number of these other, other knights, Fitzgerald, Fitzstevens, Maurice de Pendergast, those sort of guys. And he has a small force that leaves Wales with him to go back to Ireland. With that force, he ends up fighting a battle and he loses and he has to turn over hostages, but he makes a bit of a treaty with O'Connor, who's the High King of Ireland, to be able to stay and resume his kingship if he promises to behave nicely and send his foreign soldiers away. Obviously, Dermot doesn't do that. Instead, what he does is he bides his time until we have another contingent of some of these Anglo-Norman soldiers who arrive in Wexford to fight for Dermot. I just want to make sure that that's where we were at exactly. Okay, yes. So Dermot had, lost this little miniature battle with O'Connor and had promised to be good and whatnot. But then in May 1169, the second installment of these Anglo-Norman allies arrived to help Dermot. And as I had said before, initially, some of these Irish clans weren't so concerned about the arrival of these Anglo-Normans, because, they weren't that concerned about the Vikings either. They were just another kind of warring tribe, and the Irish had dealt with that previously. So why should they be concerned about these Normans? Unfortunately, that attitude doesn't work out so well. So when this force of about 500 Anglo-Norman warriors arrive, we're not talking about 500 knights, we're probably talking about 50 to 60 knights with foot soldiers and then archers as well. So it's a mixed force. They land near Wexford in the south of Leinster. And after about only 2 days of sieging the city, they are able to break through the defenses and take Wexford. And after taking Wexford in May of 1169, Dermot essentially gives the city over to Robert Fitzstevens, one of these Anglo-Norman knights who had agreed to fight for him. And now this is what is kind of the issue that some of these Irish have with it. It's not only is he bringing in foreigners, but he's giving away land to foreigners as well. So after this battle at Wexford in May of 1169, the High King of Ireland, our Rory O'Connor, he realizes kind of the destructive potential of Dermot's forces and once again seeks to make peace with him. Dermot again submits to O'Connor's rule. He hands over some more hostages to promise that he'll behave, and he also then promises to send his foreign troops away. So O'Connor says that he won't contest Dermot's retaking of the kingdom of Leinster in exchange for these hostages and for Dermot sending his troops home. But this really isn't enough for Dermot. After realizing how quickly these Norman forces were able to defeat the Hibernal Norse that lived in Wexford, he realizes what the potential is having these Anglo-Norman knights behind him. And the High Kingship is within his reach with these soldiers behind him. And that's a big deal. Dermot is really concerned about the appearance of his authority and his standing in relation to these other kings of Ireland. For example, if you don't already dislike Dermot enough, this story I'm about to recount is certainly going to solidify that opinion for you. In 1132, Dermot had recently become king of Leinster at that point, and he had wanted to appoint the abbess to the Abbey of Kildare, so the female monastery that's at Kildare. It's really popular. It's the one that was founded by St. Bridget. And the abbess at the current time had been appointed by a different king. And so she represented a different king's political standing, that sort of thing, maybe not going in the same political interests as he had. So to get this abbess out of the way, he kidnapped her and had her raped by one of his soldiers so that she could no longer be able to be the abbess of the Abbey of Kildare because she was no longer chaste. So this is how he solved his problem, by having an abbess raped to be able to appoint his own person of choice, which an abbey and an abbess isn't really that important, but it just goes to show the lengths that Diarmait is willing to take to assert his authority. So he's just not a good guy. So we have, this, as I said, that second contingent of the Anglo-Norse arrives in May 1169. It's almost a year later until Strongbow arrives. So in August of 1170, Strongbow arrives in Ireland. And now he set sail against the expressed orders of King Henry II. And now that's interesting because Henry had said that Diarmait could recruit from any one of his landed lords. But Henry feared that Strongbow in particular, who was already a powerful landowner, he's the Earl of Pembroke, he was worried that Strongbow would be able to create more of a power base in Ireland and could set himself up as a rival king to Henry. Had Diarmait not offered Strongbow the kingship of Leinster, Henry II might not have had an issue with this, but what was already done was done. So Henry actually orders Strongbow not to leave, and Strongbow in turn breaks that order and sails to Ireland anyway. So there's going to be some issues with this later. But the die is cast. He's crossing the Rubicon, or the Irish Sea. And so he lands in southern Ireland near Waterford in August of 1170. And he's got maybe about 1,000 to about 12,000 soldiers. And again, it's a mix of knights, foot soldiers, and archers. And they land near Waterford, and they're able to take the city even more rapidly than Wexford had fallen to that second contingent before. So Diarmait arrives down in Waterford after Strongbow has already taken this city. Diarmait arrives with his army, with those other Anglo-Norman lords that had arrived previously, and with his daughter Aoife, who was intended to marry Strongbow. So mid-September 1170, after Waterford's been taken and the marriage to Aoife has already occurred. This video on this painting on the PowerPoint over here is a painting of this marriage, but it was done in the late 1800s by a unionist, an Irish unionist. And so the image could almost show the Irish being excited about this wedding, but at the same time, you could also see it being kind of a nationalistic propaganda piece saying that the Irish were against this. And this painting is almost seen as a way of showing that Ireland was sort of taken over by England at this point. So it's an interesting piece. But we are going to move along here. So mid-September, the marriage has happened. All of the Anglo-Normans have been able to meet and talk with Diarmait and figure out what they're going to do next. And so they decide the next move is to take Dublin. That's the way of securing the hold on Leinster. And so they've got about 3,000 men, and they march north to take Dublin from the Hiberno-Norse, who are currently in control of it, and their king, the Hiberno-Norse king. And anticipating that Diarmait is going to make this move, Rory O'Connor, our High King of Ireland, and his allies decide to camp next to the path that he anticipates Diarmait will take his army through. And it's a path that's between the Wicklow Mountains. And so you can see on this map that I have here, this dotted line is the path that was the anticipated journey that these Anglo-Normans would take. So O'Connor is kind of positioned right around here to kind of ambush the army as they come through this pass. And so it's the most likely place. So, but in a surprise move, Strongbow takes his army, along the further and a little bit more treacherous coastal route, bypassing the I do not remember the word for that, bypassing the trap that Rory O'Connor had set up for the army over here. So they're able to already outsmart the English lords by taking this different route. And thinking kind of outside the box a little bit. So it's a really surprising move. So they're able to arrive at Dublin faster than anticipated, and they're arriving from the southeast as opposed from the southwest, which again, the Dublin Vikings, the Hiberno Norse that are there, were anticipating a different location. So their defenses had been built up towards the southeast as opposed to the southwest. So Strongbow's forces, Diarmait's forces, essentially sort of siege the area. And what they do is they pretend, they ask for negotiation talks to talk with some of the Hiberno Norse as a way of kind of getting a look at the Dublin defenses. So they freight these negotiations, and while they're inside Dublin, they're able to kind of investigate and see where the weaknesses in the walls are. And sure enough, the next night, they're able to kind of launch this surprise attack, and they're streaming over the walls in a surprise move, and they're able to take the city in a night. It's a really surprise thing. The Hiberno Norse were not prepared for it, nor were Rory O'Connor's men prepared for this to happen. They were not even in position yet to fight. So this taking of Dublin happened very quickly and unexpectedly. So a lot of the Hiberno Norse flee in their ships, and so including the king of Dublin at this time, they all flee and sail. A lot of them go to the Isle of Man, where there's still a kingdom of the Vikings located there. And once O'Connor realizes that the city's been taken by Diarmait and his forces, O'Connor retreats, assuming that the city is lost at this point. And so Diarmait is able to claim undisputed control over Dublin at this point. So again, very quick. And again, this is why Diarmait keeps these troops with him, because he's seeing how swiftly they are able to kind of break through the Irish defenses. And this is why he's seeing that he could become the High King of Ireland if he has the support of these men behind him. So with Strongbow in control of Dublin, Diarmait decides, now that he's got this powerful army behind him, he's going to settle some scores. Remember, this is not a great guy. So he takes a contingent of the Anglo-Norman soldiers with him, and they march into Breffni and essentially start plundering the areas ruled by O'Rourke. Remember, the king of Breffni, O'Rourke, whose wife had been kidnapped by Diarmait. So while Diarmait and these Anglo-Normans are raiding in Breffni, and they're plundering the borderlands held by O'Rourke, they're doing this so much so that O'Connor, who had been given hostages by Diarmait, and remember, one of those hostages was one of Diarmait's sons. O'Connor is convinced that the only thing that they can do to maybe see to bring Diarmait into check is by executing these hostages, and he does. So he executes Diarmait's son, and that doesn't actually stop Diarmait from fighting. That's not going to prevent him from doing that. However, Diarmait is stopped eventually. He is killed in one of these skirmishes on the border. We don't know exactly what he was doing. We don't have a lot of recorded evidence, but we know that his death was on May 1st, 1171. So there was a couple of months that went by between the taking of Dublin and the death of Diarmait. And now this death is really kind of it takes Strongbow off guard. It raised the question of Diarmait's inheritance that he was giving to his son-in-law. It brings this up sooner than Strongbow would have liked, because he hasn't solidified himself in the country. He's barely even been married for long enough. And so it's not something he had anticipated having to defend quite so quickly. And seeing this death of Diarmait as an opportunity, that ousted king of the Hiberno Norse of Dublin actually returns to Dublin shortly after Diarmait's death is made known, trying to reclaim Dublin. But he fails. He's not able to oust our Anglo-Normans from Dublin itself. And then O'Connor and O'Rourke try once again. They actually lay siege to Dublin, hoping that they'll be able to expel these invaders. So the combined forces of O'Rourke and O'Connor is nearly 30,000 at this point. And so they're camping outside the walls of Dublin. They've blockaded the River Liffey, and they've managed to blockade the harbor as well. And they're stationed outside of Dublin for about 2 months. And 2 months isn't really that long of a time period. Strongbow had been prepared to siege Dublin for longer than 2 months. And so they do have quite a bit of foodstuffs with them. They've got supplies, they have water access. So it's not as if they're starving in the city. But Strongbow decides to start negotiating with O'Connor. One of the things that he does is he promises that he will swear fealty to O'Connor as the High King of Ireland if he would recognize Strongbow's claim to the throne of Leinster. Now, this is really kind of a freight because he doesn't anticipate that O'Connor would approve of this or give in to this. So these negotiations are really going nowhere, but it's distracting O'Connor from what's going on elsewhere. And O'Connor's not willing to give into this legitimacy. And so they're kind of just dragging this whole thing out. And so kind of, it's one of these things where desperate times come from desperate measures. Strongbow knows that he can last in this siege for a while. O'Connor is pretty determined to stay there as well for a duration of time. So Strongbow decides just to push the matter in the same way that he did when he was sieging Dublin, a few months previously. So in a surprise move, the Anglo-Normans launch a surprise attack against O'Connor and O'Rourke's troops. And because it is kind of a surprise and it takes them off guard, even though the Anglo-Normans are outnumbered about 15-1, they're able to defeat O'Rourke and O'Connor's army. And a lot of it has to do, it's not that they killed all 30,000 of those men. The Anglo-Normans have a lot more discipline to their ranks. They are able to stay and fight, whereas the Irish were, they're not defending their own lands at this point the way that the Anglo-Normans were thinking that they're going to defend lands that they're eventually going to rule. So a lot of the Irish just retreat as opposed to fighting. So it's not like we're killing an entire army. They're just leaving and fleeing, essentially. So the Anglo-Normans under Strongbow's command are able to solidify their control over Dublin with this surprise attack and defeat of O'Rourke and O'Connor. And it's just this overwhelming victory. And it really solidifies Strongbow's hold over Dublin. He's also holding Waterford, and then his other men that had come over previously are holding Wexford. So they have three of the most powerful cities in Ireland that are all a part of the Kingdom of Leinster. So Strongbow's claim to the throne of Leinster is now solidified as well. So he's in a pretty good position at this point. And Henry II is not happy about this information when he finds out about it. Again, he's concerned that a powerful lord that he has in Wales is now setting up a kingdom in Ireland right next to his kingdom in England. And that is a concern for him. So Henry II hears about what's happening. He knows that Strongbow went over to Ireland against his expressed wishes. And he decides that he absolutely has to get involved at this point, especially considering Strongbow had gone against his expressed wishes. And Henry can't abide that he had been disregarded in this sense. And at this point in 1171, Henry has a lot more motivation to intervene in Ireland beyond the fact that he wants to bring Strongbow into check. His very own admittance into heaven, into the afterlife, is at stake. In 1166, when Diarmait first asked for Henry's help, Henry had other things to deal with. When he had first received the papal bull, Laudabilior, in 1155, he had other things to deal with. But in 1171, things have changed. For Henry, from the start of his reign, some of the things he had been the most concerned about was extending his own authority over all of England, and that included the churches within England as well. And one thing he was really concerned about was the court cases that were able to fall under clerical jurisdiction, especially murder cases. There's this idea that if you could read from memory certain Latin lines from the Bible, you could prove that you had taken holy orders and could be tried in a church court as opposed to a secular court. And this was something that Henry wanted to end, this practice. And so in order to extend royal authority over the church, Henry sponsored his good friend and political ally, Thomas Becket, who had been his Lord Chancellor of England. He sponsored him for the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. And he had hoped that by having his good friend in that position, they could work together and kind of break down that jurisdiction of the church. However, this appointment really backfires on Henry, and we see Thomas Becket taking his role as a spiritual leader of England actually quite seriously, and thwarting Henry at pretty much every opportunity that he could. Because again, he had kind of been part of those plans to take over the authority of the church. So this tension between the two of these men, it grows to such a certain extent that the Pope is actually forced to intervene between them. And Henry's conflict with Becket escalates to such a point that in December of 1170, Henry's at court. He's reading, a letter that describes something that Becket had done. And in an absolute fit of rage, Henry proclaims to his court, supposedly, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights from his court took him at his word, if not his explicit order, and they rode to Canterbury and brutally murdered Becket on the altar of the church in Canterbury on December 29th, 1170. This is a big deal. The murder of the archbishop on the altar of his church is awful, and these knights claim they were doing it on the orders of Henry II. So Henry has to act fast in order to regain the Pope's favor. And he thought that by taking up those instructions given in that papal bull Laudabilior and that Ireland cause of bringing the Irish church back into the fold might just be the thing to convince the Pope to not excommunicate him. Henry hoped that by fulfilling the wishes of the previous Pope, this Pope Adrian, he might be forgiven for the role he played in the murder of Becket. So Henry has several motivations in launching his conquest of Ireland at this point. Concern over Strongbow's position, but also his own position in heaven. So there's a lot of motivations that are going into this. So Henry II decides to launch his own invasion of Ireland. He arrives near Waterford in October of 1171. He arrives with 500 knights, 4,000 foot soldiers, and a large contingent of archers. So he has more people in his army than all of Strongbow and all of Diarmait's armies combined. So he doubles the army. He not only comes with people, but he comes with siegecraft machines to siege castles. He brings, his own supplies. He brings his own blacksmiths. He brings all of his own food, because apparently he heard that the Irish food would not sit well with his own personal diet. So he brings his own chefs too. So he lands in Waterford with all of these people, and he sets up camp, and he stays for about 6 months. And during that time period, many of the native Irish kings, our local small rees, our mid-level rees, even some of our high-level rees, all kind of voluntarily come and pledge homage to Henry during this time period, including our Tiernan O'Rourke, the King of Breffni. We also see, the McCarthys of South Munster submit, the O'Briens of North Munster submit, the O'Carrolls of Orrell, and the Manduc Levies of Ulayad up in Ulster. They all come and submit to Henry II. Now, these Irish rees are content to submit because A, it's common in Ireland to submit to a more powerful overlord, and B, they don't see Henry as being worse than these other Anglo-Normans who have already taken over in Ireland. They don't see Henry as being worse than Strongbow or the Fitzgerald or the Fitzstevens that have already been there for a year or two at this point. They think Henry is there to check the support and the power of these Anglo-Normans that are there. Henry is known as a fair-minded king who cares about the law, which again, we know the Irish care about the law. Brehon law is very important to them. And they think that he will keep them in check. And part of this is because they see Strongbow's relationship with Diarmait as something that because remember, Diarmait doesn't have a good reputation amongst the Irish. And the fact that Strongbow allied with him and married into his family is something that concerns some of these Irish. And so they're hoping Henry is better than Strongbow. That's why we have so many of these lords that are submitting. We do see that O'Connor, the High King of Ireland, also the King of Connaught, he doesn't submit, nor do the O'Neills up in mid-Ulster as well. So there's a number of people who don't submit. However, O'Connor does apparently send a messenger to Henry's court, but there's no exchange of fealty or anything like that. While Henry has arrived, what he does, he forces Strongbow to pay him homage and to turn over all the lands he had taken. So Strongbow has to turn over Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, and all of the areas that he's taken. Henry claims all three of those cities. He takes Dublin, Wexford, and Waterford and those surrounding areas as his own personal territory. He collects those taxes. He's going to make the profit from those ports. And then he divides up the neighboring territories amongst his other loyal lords who had either come with him or had originally gone over to help Diarmait originally. What he does is he demotes Strongbow from King of Leinster to Lord of Leinster, which is a far more English title and far more acceptable to Henry. And to balance out the power of Strongbow in Ireland, he appoints Hugh de Lacy, who is a friend of the king, as the Lord of Meath. Now remember, Meath is that very rich area that Diarmait and O'Rourke, the king of Breffni, were fighting about originally that started all of this going. So appointing Hugh de Lacy the Lord of Meath is a big deal from him. Strongbow has no choice but to submit to the royal command of Henry. There's nothing he can do against the force that Henry brought with him. So not only were some of those Irish kings excited to see Henry arrive, but the people within the Irish church are pretty excited for Henry to be there too, because they know that the reason he's there is partly because of that the papal bull, Laudabilior. So they welcome Henry, and they really hope that he can help them build a stronger bridge with the Roman Church and strengthen those reform movements that were already underway from those previous church synods we had talked about. But there's a number of practices they particularly want to deal with now that Henry's there. And that includes lax marriage practices, eating meat during Lent, heaven forbid, not paying tithes to the church, that's probably our big one, and also people not showing sufficient respect for church property and clerics. This is also a big deal for them. So Henry calls together another large church council, and this is called the Synod of Cashel, and his court chronicler, Gerald of Wales, who we've talked about before, that's what some of those primary sources are that you guys can read are from. Gerald of Wales gives a pretty good account of the Synod of Cashel, and we see a number of these issues being resolved at that. And there's several decrees that are put out that are intended to bring the Irish church back into alignment with the Roman church as well, and to kind of correct those abuses of the clergy and some of those things that those Cistercian monks had complained about to St. Bernard. So Henry hopefully is able to do that with some of these decrees that he had issued, and kind of by placing his Anglo-Normans in positions of power throughout the southern part of Ireland, they're far more likely that these church reforms are going to be put into place and actually followed through with. Henry remains in Ireland until April 17th, 1172, so about 6 months or so. And he receives news that the papal legates from the Pope are waiting to talk with him in Normandy to settle up on that Becket affair. So it's a big deal, but Henry did what he could in the meantime. You know, he took up the Pope's cause. He's bringing the Irish church back into conformity with Roman practices. So he's done what he can. But he needs to leave soon to meet with these papal legates in Normandy. So before he leaves, he appoints Hugh de Lacy as his justiciar, who is essentially his chief officer, his governor of Ireland, to assert his royal authority over those lands that have now been conquered by his followers. But there's still quite a few issues that have been left unhandled in Ireland after Henry II leaves. The High King, Rory O'Connor, has still not submitted to Henry, nor have those the O'Neills up in Ulster. But Henry has more pressing issues to deal with. So after Henry leaves, we do have a number of things that happen. Okay. So after Henry leaves, the Irish essentially go back on their promise to submit to Henry, and they start attacking these Anglo-Norman holdings. So they really with the High King O'Connor and start attacking these holdings that have been given over to Anglo-Normans. So Tiernan O'Rourke, the King of Breffni, who had submitted to Henry II, he turns his coat. He claims it's because those lands in Meath that Henry gave to Hugh de Lacy, some of those lands had originally been held by O'Rourke. Remember that three-way split of Meath that had happened under a previous High King of Ireland? So O'Rourke claims that his submission to Henry was voided when these lands were given away from him. So he turns and re-allies with O'Connor. And they start fighting the different areas that Hugh de Lacy has now put some of his followers in. So they switch sides, they start raiding. And during some of these raids, Hugh de Lacy had actually asked if they could have a parley to discuss some of these issues. And at this parley, O'Rourke is killed in kind of an underhanded manner. And this killing of O'Rourke is unfortunate, but it doesn't stop O'Connor's determination to continue to assert his authority over these lands and push these Anglo-Normans out. So he manages to gather some more allies up who are willing to kind of fight against, and O'Connor and these other Irish allies target the new castles that Hugh de Lacy starts building. He built a castle at Trim and another at Dulek, and O'Connor and his allies destroy both of these castles. You know, they're not these tall stone castles we're thinking, but they're mostly Mott and Bailey, wood castles that they kind of put up. And actually, O'Rourke and his allies march all the way to the outskirts of Dublin, where Strongbow was located, before turning back in the face of a winter siege. And the reason they turn back in the winter siege is the Irish usually don't fight in the winter, but also it seems pretty obvious that after having fought for several years in a row, they probably don't have the resources or the food supplies to keep an army in the field for that amount of time, which is why they retreat in the face of winter. This retreat gives Strongbow and his soldiers the opportunity to fight in the winter because they don't have any restrictions on that. They have a lot of supplies that were left to them by Henry, but they also have these port cities, so they're bringing in supplies from their homelands as well. So Strongbow is able to push further north out of Dublin and west into the county of Offaly. And Henry II, after Strongbow is able to kind of assert this authority, actually makes Strongbow viceroy of Ireland. So he's kind of trusting Strongbow with a bit more authority now that he's kind of proven himself. But in 1173, after appointing Strongbow as the viceroy, he also demands that Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy pull out of Ireland and come to the continent to help support Henry II in some wars that he's battling in now. So he's forcing, his lords who had just established a hold in Ireland to retreat. They're allowed to leave a garrison force behind them, but Henry II needs them. And the reason Henry II needs them, it's a very long and complicated story. I don't know how many of you have an idea about Irish or English history at this time period, but to kind of summarize it, Henry II and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, essentially fall out completely as a married couple after the birth of their last child, John, in 1166. Henry has not only mistreated his wife, but he mistreats his sons too. Not physically, but definitely mentally and in terms of providing for them as well. His authoritarian methods of rule had really alienated each of his sons, and they side with their mother in kind of these domestic disputes that they're having. And so together, Eleanor and her sons took advantage of the opportunity of Henry being in Ireland and also this whole Thomas Becket situation to revolt against Henry. And they revolt multiple times before this, but this one was really serious. And it's this latest revolt that pulls Henry off of the continent, because under no circumstances does he want his wife or his sons meeting with the papal legates to determine whether or not Henry will be excommunicated. because when a king is excommunicated, it essentially says that can no Christian owes fealty to an excommunicated person. So that means no lord who holds land in Henry's kingship really owes him fealty for that anymore. And so it essentially takes away his throne. So he wants to prevent his wife and prince's sons from dealing with this situation. So he arrives in Normandy where the revolt is happening. It's very serious. Eleanor is openly advocating for support for her sons in Aquitaine, and his sons are living at the court of his political rival and Eleanor's ex-husband, the King of France. And under the King of France, King Louis' supervision, the boys are raising support for their revolt against their father. The counts of Flanders, Boulogne, Champagne, Blois, Anjou, Maine, Poitou, Brittany, all of these lords, and including some English lords and the King of Scotland, all unite against Henry II. So this is a really serious uprising. So that's why Henry's pulling Hugh de Lacy and Strongbow out of Ireland, because he needs as much support as he can possibly get. So Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy arrive, they bring their troops with them, and war is breaking out on the continent around May 1173. And the fighting is mostly focused in Normandy. It's really the only area that's still staunchly supportive of Henry II. There's not really a lot of battlefield warfare. It's mostly sieges, skirmishes, the burning and plundering of towns, these different kind of surprise attacks. And in fact, actually, the King of Scotland isn't invading. He's not fighting in Brittany, but what he does do is he starts invading northern England to sort of divide Henry's attention and his forces. So he's kind of implementing a scorched earth policy in northern England and Northumbria a bit. And so there's uprisings kind of happening all over Henry II's empire. And including in Ireland, his newest acquisition. Ireland revolts almost as soon as Strongbow and de Lacy sailed away. Those recently taken places by the Anglo-Normans are the first things that the Irish target, because there's only these small garrisons that have been left behind, and they're left behind in hostile territory. So the Irish lords individually tax Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy's lands, but at times they also ally with other Normans to fight against other Irish lords. So it's the same thing that the Irish did with the Vikings. The Irish would fight the Vikings, but at the same time, they would ally with the Vikings to fight other Irish. So it's, again, kind of getting these invaders involved in internal politics right away from the beginning. But this allying with Normans to fight other Irish is really counterproductive. And it ends up with the Normans, in some cases, actually increasing their land holdings because of some of these battles that happen. And Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy are able to return to Ireland fairly quickly to deal with these rebellions that have happened in their absence. And this really means asserting their authority over the areas that they've been granted. And this is easier said than done. But O'Connor, because O'Connor has been able to kind of rally these other Irish lords behind him and launch some of these organized, successful raids into Leinster and Meath, kind of undermining that authority of Strongbow and de Lacy. Okay, I realize I went too far here. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to talk about in terms of Anglo-Norman issues that are happening. So some of the big things that we want to look at when we're talking about Ireland at this point in regards to Anglo-Normans is that Henry II is still interested in creating a working relationship with Rory O'Connor, working with the High King of Ireland to sort of at least have, so that he's not fighting constantly in this land. But he also at the same time is wanting to look towards the expansion of those Anglo-Norman colonies. So he wants to come to terms with the Irish High King, but he also still wants to acquire more land. And so it's a difficult task that he's sort of setting himself to. And how he's expecting his Anglo-Norman lords to go about doing this for him comes through in a number of ways. So we have, how do the Normans hold on to the territories that they now hold in Ireland? The way that they do this is they start introducing the European feudal system into Ireland. Ireland had not had kind of that feudal land distribution that the rest of continental Europe had. When the Normans invaded when the Normans invaded England in 1066, one of the things that William the Conqueror was able to do is he redistributed all of the lands of England to his followers, who then gave him fealty and homage in exchange for those lands. And then those lords gave away some of their lands in exchange for fealty and homage. And it kind of trickles down in that sense. And so that's what Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy do in Ireland. They each subdivide their lands up, and they essentially give them away to tenants and subtenants that then owe them military service or annual rents. So they're owing them homage, but they're also promising to provide him with a certain number of soldiers if he needs them. And so these become fiefs, Fiefs, fiefs. I should have had that on the slide, I apologize. And so these fiefs get divided up smaller and given away to more people. And so we have kind of a really kind of a trickle down situation where land is being given to a number of people. And the majority of the people they're giving that land to are coming over from England. So they're either English or they're other Anglo-Normans, that situation. So they're bringing in people. These new landowners are responsible for defending the lands that they've been given from the Irish attack. So Hugh de Lacy and Strongbow are able to kind of ease some of that pressure on themselves for defending all of these lands by subcontracting out the defense to these new landowners that they have brought in. So those new landowners, it's their job to defend their lands from the previous tenants of that land. So it makes it a little bit easier for them. And there's also this process called incastalization, which is a fancy word for castle building. And just like the Crusaders did in the Holy Lands, to assert their control over a certain area by building a castle that they can then rule those areas from, the same thing happens in Ireland. Hugh de Lacy is actually known as this huge castle builder. He built a bunch of castles across his areas in Meath, and many of them are still around today. But these castles assert control over areas, and it also gives them a protected space in which to administer their lands from. So incastalization and also bringing in land feudalism into Ireland is how Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy plan on fulfilling Henry II's wishes by taking over Ireland. So in addition to that, we do see the church in Ireland trying to act as a peace broker between Henry II and the warring Irish kings in Ireland. So in 1175, the Archbishop of Dublin, Lawrence O'Toole, brokers an agreement between Henry's representatives and O'Connor as the High King of Ireland. And this is called the Treaty of Windsor. And I think this is one of the primary sources I provided for you in the Dropbox. So what this Treaty of Windsor does is it brought temporary peace between the Irish and the Anglo-Norman invaders. It settled O'Connor as a vassal king of Henry. So O'Connor submitted to Henry as his overlord, but he's allowed to stay as the High King. And this treaty also lays out the lands that are supposed to be currently held by the Anglo-Normans, as well as those ones that are held by the Irish. And the English are holding those lands in fealty to Henry II, and this is supposed to stop the Norman expansion. That's part of the agreement with O'Connor's, that the Anglo-Normans will not continue pushing further out of the lands that they've already taken. O'Connor promises to stop his raiding and to stop supporting revolts from within. In addition, he agrees to offer tribute to Henry II annually in the form of 1 cattle hide per every 10 animals that are slaughtered. So he's essentially giving him a 10th tithe. Henry also declares, as part of this agreement, that if any Irish lords who have submitted to him, to Henry II, that have submitted to Henry II, if they refuse to turn over tribute to O'Connor as the High King, O'Connor has the right to remove them from power. And if need be, O'Connor can call upon the Viceroy of Ireland to aid him in the removing of that rebelling lord. So Henry agrees to kind of, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back, sort of a situation with this. It's a pretty good deal for O'Connor. But O'Connor also agrees to stop pushing back against those lands held by the king's vassals. And since O'Connor was the most powerful king and the one organizing the majority of these revolts, him promising not to do that pushback is also a good thing for Henry II. So it's a good deal across the board. I'm going to talk for just a little bit longer, and then we can open it up to questions. Strongbow, unfortunately, dies not long after this Treaty of Windsor is proclaimed. He dies in 1176, which essentially takes away Henry's second most powerful lord in Ireland. And Strongbow leaves only a young daughter as his heiress at this point. So what Henry does is he takes that girl as his ward, and he absorbs all of Strongbow's lands as the Lord of Leinster into his own personal income. And so all of that tax, all of that money that's coming out of Leinster is now being funneled into the English royal treasury. And he's keeping all of that money until the girl is old enough to wed, and her husband would then take control of the land as the new Lord of Leinster. So this leaves Hugh de Lacy, the justiciar, as the governor of Ireland. And Hugh de Lacy does something that's pretty interesting, and it's going to say something about what all of these people who try to invade Ireland end up doing, is they end up being absorbed into the Irish landscape. Hugh de Lacy, actually behind Henry II's back, marries a daughter of O'Connor. So he marries the daughter of the High King of Ireland, the King of Connaught, and this really kind of muddles the waters there, and it gives rise to this rumor that de Lacy is trying to set himself up as the heir to O'Connor in the same way that Strongbow had been made the heir to Diarmait. So it's this marriage really kind of muddles the water, but it also raises his power and influence over the native Irish lords and kings. And then, to make matters worse, in 1177, without permission from Henry II, a 27-year-old Norman adventurer named John de Courcy, he had arrived in Ireland. He had been part of that first contingent of Anglo-Norman soldiers who had gone over with Diarmait back over to Ireland to sort of defend Leinster originally. This John de Courcy, he leads a contingent of a small garrison from Dublin. Undercover, he leads them north to Downpatrick. Remember, Downpatrick is where St. Patrick is supposedly buried and had landed. And he invades the Ulad areas, which are known as modern-day Antrim and Down. So if you look at the map over here on the PowerPoint slide, Ulad is this easternmost part of Ulster. And de Courcy invades these lands so quickly, and with, again, organized Anglo-Norman knights behind him, he's able to defeat those local Gaelic lords, and he manages to take most of eastern Ulster in a kind of a quick raid. So this region, I've been referring to it as Ulster, but it's not known as Ulster up until this point. We think the reason that Ulster comes up as a name is it's this combination of Ulad, the Gaelic name for it, and the Ster, like, you have Munster and Leinster, and so they're putting together the Ul and the Ster into Ulster to kind of make it sound a little bit more similar to the rest of the lands in Ireland. So de Courcy, once he's kind of taken these lands, he founds the town of Carrickfergus, and he begins work on a very elaborate castle there to sort of assert his authority over the land. And then, again, in common style with these adventurers who come to Ireland, he marries the daughter of the Viking king of the Isle of Man. Her name is Africa, and he marries her. And the Isle of Man has control over pretty much the Northern Irish Sea. And so it's a smart move for de Courcy, because he's right there on the northern part of the Irish Sea, and now he's allied with the guy who kind of has the navy that's controlling it. So it's a big deal. And this taking of that land really throws the Treaty of Windsor to the winds. But Henry II wasn't really completely done with it yet. And this is going to be something I'm going to talk about next week, because I don't know if we have time today. But Henry ends up throwing the Treaty of Windsor out with some moves that he makes next. I know, Bud, do you think I could talk for another 5 minutes, or should we stop now? Okay, you know what? I'm just going to keep talking. And, if we need to have questions that go a little bit longer, we can. So after John de Courcy does this, Henry II essentially decides that the Treaty of Windsor is nothing. And so in May 1177, Henry II claims Munster, which again is not a land that they had taken originally in the invasion. Henry claims the cities of Cork and Limerick, and he hands out the surrounding areas to loyal liegemen. Now, none of these lands were originally taken by those Anglo-Normans, and so Henry claiming them and then gifting these lands away is a complete breach of the Treaty of Windsor. And who he gives this to is interesting. So Robert Fitzstephen, who is one of those other first lords to answer Diarmait's call originally, he is made the Earl of Desmond, and he's given the areas surrounding Cork. So those lands that the McCarthys were in charge of, he's given these lands of power. And so the way that he asserts himself over those lands is that Robert Fitzstephen's really, he's facing this uphill battle. And we have a lot of skirmishes that are going on, a lot of sieges, a lot of needless death is happening. But a compromise is able to be reached, and a compromise is able to be reached not through the church, but through some of our Brehon lawmakers actually get involved in this situation. And they come to an agreement between Fitzstephen's, the new Earl of Desmond, and the McCarthys. And they divide the Kingdom of Cork up into 3/4, or they divide it into fourths, and essentially say that Fitzstephen's can keep a fourth of that kingdom, and the native lords, the McCarthys, will keep 3/4 of it. And they will agree not to raid each other's lands, which we'll see, obviously, they don't actually abide by. But the other areas of Munster that Henry gives away, he gives to a man named Philip de Bracy and to another man named Theobald Butler. And they are given the lands that are held by the O'Briens, that kingdom of Thomond, which is in northern Munster around the areas of Limerick. And he gives them those lands to sort of split between them. And between the two of them, it takes their armies 8 years to subdue that region. They're not coming to any compromises the way that the Earl of Desmond was coming to compromises. And so after 8 years, they're able to subdue the whole area. The northern lands are given over to the Butlers, who become known as the Earls of Ormond, and that'll be an earlship. And then the de Bracy family become the Lords of Limerick through this division. And so O'Connor had been trying to abide by this Treaty of Windsor. Even after Henry takes those lands of Munster, he's still trying to sort of treat through the Archbishop of Dublin, that O'Toole, back with Henry II, but it's not going well. And O'Connor can't ignore the fact that in 1183, Henry II asked the Pope to grant his youngest son the throne of Ireland. So Henry II asked the Pope to make his son John the King of Ireland. And O'Connor can't overlook this blatant attempt to steal the high throne from himself. And unfortunately, O'Connor has been kind of a bad High King of Ireland. He's essentially watched his entire country get taken over and done really nothing to stop it. So his family forces him to retire from the High Kingship and as the King of Connaught. He retires in 1183 and he becomes a monk at the monastery at Clonmanoise, so that very secular monastery we had talked about previously, and he's actually buried there still. So Prince John is made the Lord of Ireland in 1186 by these papal legates, the Pope's representatives, and he's going to assume his role as the Lord of Ireland when we start talking next week, and we'll see what he ends up doing.